Hello, this is your Unit 2 review for your exam over political beliefs and behaviors. So anytime you want to, you can just pause me and go get something to eat, or you can look over your notes, or better yet, I'll ask you a question and you see if you can answer them before you look at your notes. But feel free to follow along. I will do this several hundred times because I'm looking at my own notes on the computer in front of me to figure out where it is that we're at. So let's start off with the supplemental reading from the unit Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, and the whole idea is social capital. Of course, you know what that is. It's connectedness. It's people with face-to-face conversations who move things forward. So right now, ask yourself, what are the advantages of social capital and what has destroyed social capital over the last, 50 years or so? Answer that. So focus especially on the things that have destroyed social capital. Focus on the technology, on the changes in lifestyle where people move out to the suburbs and get physically farther apart, where mom is working outside of the house instead of inside of the house, and just the generational change that happened from one generation, which I'm going to call my generation, to my parents' generation, who were joiners, and my generation who didn't join as much, and your generation who doesn't join even more. Yeah, get out of the house, you know? All right, another term in that reading is reciprocity. Reciprocity, the expectation that somebody will help me, but I don't necessarily keep score. They will just do things because we have this bond, we have this connectedness. Okay, so social capital, upside, downside, reciprocity, and changes that have brought about the decline of social capital. We're going to revisit that term in future units, but it's one of my favorites. So again, make sure you're familiar with that reading. All right, let's start off with some of the characteristics of American political culture. Recall that the word politics has two components to it. The first component is winning an election, and the second component is making policy. You cannot do the second until you accomplish the first, which is why elections are so whacked and people spend so much money and do such crazy things to win. Okay, so some of the characteristics from your notes, I'm just going to go down the list. We talked about liberty from the early Founding Fathers documents, equality from the Declaration of Independence, things like majority rule and popular sovereignty. There's never a bad time. Whenever you don't know the answer on one of my tests, just write down popular sovereignty and you got like a 10% chance of getting it right. Okay, better than a 0% chance. 10% better. Okay. Also, be familiar with the term political efficacy. Efficacy is the degree to which we believe we matter. So political efficacy is the degree to which you believe that you can influence the political process, and people who have a high degree of political efficacy go ahead and vote. They volunteer, they get involved in political campaigns, they write letters to the editor, etc. All right, now we move on to political culture. So again, we're using the term political. And so where do we get our opinions, our thoughts, ideas about politics? Are we red? Are we blue? Are we purple? Where does that come from? The dominant factor is always your parents. And the stronger your family is in terms of a cohesive family unit, the stronger that influence will be. Far from the only influence, we also have the workplace. We have our personal faith life. We have the school we attend, the people that we meet, our friends, our peer group often is an influence on us politically. Now, let's think about this historically. If we look at American history, when did our political values change? There are several different times and places. The first is at the onset of the United States. Hey, sometimes that light goes on and then it goes off again. It's not really depending on what I'm thinking. It just happens. All right, back to our story. So in American history, we have the early documents, which were focused on liberty, Declaration of Independence especially. And then we have suffrage. Anytime you increase the number of people who vote or change the voting pool, you change politics. When you add groups of people like women, like African-American males, like people ages 18 to 21, you change the political culture, absolutely. The most dominant one is definitely the New Deal, because that's a fundamental change in how we view and what we expect from our national government. And we also look at the era where the federal government actually started to regulate big business, the era of the robber barons and the super rich. So that's also a changing point in our political culture in American history. Next, let's go with liberals and conservatives. My. So just ask yourself, what's the difference in how a liberal and a conservative views the role of government? Go ahead, answer that in your head. All right, so if we know that, then a lot of this unit is very much logical and common sense when we put it together. Why are different groups of people, different demographic groups, oriented politically to either a Republican or a Democratic perspective? So let's start with the Republican perspective, which would be a limited government. So if I want my government limited, I want tax cuts. I want more of my money kept with me. So right away, you're going to say, well, people of higher income levels tend to be more conservative. Well, you're darn right, because they have more money to keep and they don't need the government programs as much. Conversely, on the liberal side of things, they're looking for more government programs. They believe government to be a big active force that does good in the world. And so they want to go ahead and have those government programs to try and solve the social problems. So typically we will see a lot of programs on the Democratic side. And on the Republican side, we'll want minimal number of programs that we spend money on, with the exception of national defense. Republicans like them some guns. They always have. Okay. Now, when we look at social issues, and remember, now we're getting into our political compass. Now we're getting into, are we on the economic scale, left, right? Or are we on the social scale, authoritarian and libertarian? Republicans actually tend to drift oftentimes toward the authoritarian end of things. In other words, they think the government, the federal government, has a large role to play in the social and moral norms of America and should pursue those goals. And if you think, well, what's a social issue as opposed to economic issue? Well, economic, you spend money on it. Social issues, for example, abortion, you don't necessarily spend money on that. You have a strong opinion, you want laws or you don't want laws on it from a political perspective, but you don't, quote, spend money on it. All right? Democrats, conversely, have tended to want less government involvement in social issues. So when we hear the term authoritarian, it's not necessarily Republican or Democratic. When we hear libertarian, it's not necessarily Republican or Democratic. It can differ on an issue-by-issue basis. All right, so again, as I look over my notes, some of the things that Democrats tend to love: government programs, healthcare, education, Social Security, unions, affirmative action. They tend to be pro-choice on abortion, and they want higher taxes and a smaller national defense. Republicans tend to want a larger national defense, always tax cuts. They tend to be pro-life on abortion, against affirmative action. They tend to be for prayer in schools, and they want things handled on more of a local level, government-wise, than on a national level. So again, these are all tendencies. They're not absolutes, but we talk in tendencies because they're accurate. All right. Let's move on to just a couple other political ideals. Socialism. Socialism would be a belief that the government basically ought to own everything that makes money in America. It would be on a scale where you take liberalism and then go much farther even than liberals want. Okay? Communist Russia, socialist, because the government owns everything that can make money. Okay? It's not a real common belief in America, though Democrats, some get accused of being socialist. Environmentalism is in your notes, but honestly, that's more of a Northern European thing. Don't worry about that. Libertarianism, again, minimal government involvement in anything. So no laws regulating what my morals are, no national defense that goes around the world and spends billions of dollars there. Minimal government, and let's take care of ourselves. That would be the libertarian view of life. Now, as I go over to, now I'm on chapter 5 notes, and I'm looking at political socialization. Basically, how are we socialized? How are we influenced to pick up on our political viewpoints? All right, we're going to be obsessed with demographics. A demographic is a population characteristic. So as you look at me right now, you can pick out some of my demographics. There's no getting around it. He's white. There's no getting around it. He's a he, and he's in a particular age group. Since I work at Xavier, I'm in a particular income level. Yeah, that one. Okay. As you look right there it is, a demographic. That is a wedding ring. As if you looked at my double mortgage, you would see, yes, 4 kids. That's a demographic as well. happily married, rapidly Catholic, and these are all demographics that can help define me. Now, it doesn't mean that if you know all of those demographics, you can predict exactly where I am politically. Okay? I like to remain an enigma. However, if you have, let's say, 1,000 people who share very, very similar characteristics that I do, well, then you can predict and very, very accurately predict how that group of people is going to vote, how they're going to orient politically. For example, I'd say, I'm not saying this is accurate, but I'd say Mr. Schulte and I would have a similar political outlook. Why? Because we have the same race, we have the same religious outlook, we have the same marital status, same number of kids, relatively same income, probably the same double mortgage, though I've never asked. Okay, but you get the idea. If we know the demographics, we can predict the politics. So there's another term which political scientists like to use. It's an awkward term. It's called a cleavage, and a cleavage is another word for a demographic. So what they like to say is if you have reinforcing cleavages, in other words, similar population characteristics or similar demographics, you're much, much more likely to be similar politically. Whereas if you have cross-cutting cleavages, okay, in other words, if somebody has a lot of different population characteristics from me, we are likely to be far apart politically. All right, a couple terms from your notes here. First term is called the Solid South. In other words, geographically speaking, does the United States geography play into your politics? Well, we know that certain parts of the United States tend to be certain ways politically. On each coast, you tend to have liberals. The Deep South, you tend to have conservatives. Rocky Mountain states, conservatives. In the Midwest, you tend to have unpredictability, which is why the winner of the presidential election typically wins the Midwest. Okay, a term you ought to know is called the Solid South, and they call it the Solid South because for 100 years straight, in other words, from 1860 to 1960, we saw the South vote Democratic. I mean, pretty much everywhere for 100 years straight. Why? Because Lincoln was a Republican. All right. Then in 1960, all of a sudden, we see that change. Okay, we see that change, and they go from being solidly Democratic to solidly Republican. Why was that? Well, honestly, you have to look at the racial component for one of those reasons. The Democrats tended to push civil rights a little harder than the Republicans did at that time period. And so a lot of the white South was resistant to that politically. And so they went Republican. Also, Republicans have always wanted more control at the state level. And that's always been a deeply held belief in the southern part of the United States, what I'll call Dixie, that more power should be at the state level of government and not up there in Washington, D.C. Okay? We're doing well. All right, now I'm going to break down these demographics as we did in class and ask yourself, how does this orient people politically? Again, I'm going to argue that it's highly logical, predictable, and that when I give you these demographics, you can predict, all right, does that orient a person more to the liberal or conservative end of things? So first of all, what about race? Don't overthink this, all right? White folks nationally make more money than people who are Hispanic, than people who are African American. Not as much as Asian Americans, but white folks tend to be more Republican because they make more money, okay? People in the African American and Hispanic racial categories tend to make less money. Hence, they tend to go more for the Democratic or liberal end of things where social programs can help. If I let's look at Congress for a minute. Congress does not at all reflect the population of America in terms of racial breakdown or in terms of gender breakdown. We have roughly 90%, not roughly, we do have 91% of the Senate is still white, and roughly 75% of the House of Representatives is white. Whereas in terms of the population, 62%, something like that is white. Okay? So Congress as a whole does not reflect the United States. What about gender? Men and women, how does that orient you politically? Okay, again, I'm not saying everything politically is determined by economics, but a lot of it is. Men tend to vote more Republican because men tend to make more money. Again, as I mentioned in class, a Democratic candidate for president has never won the white male vote, ever. No matter, even if the election's not close, Republicans win the white male vote. Now, what about women? Do women go more for Democrats or Republicans? They tend to vote more for Democrats, but it's not a monstrous shift like you would think. Okay? Women tend to vote a little bit more Democratic, one, because they don't make as much money, and two, because they tend to have more of a focus on social issues like education, like poverty, like daycare issues. Democrats have tended to address these a little bit more with funding for social programs. So women have tended to go on the Democratic end of things. There's probably a conception that because the Democratic Party is pro-choice, that women would go there in large numbers. Honestly, that factor is kind of overplayed, okay? It is a factor, but not the monstrous factor that some would have you believe it is. All right, in terms of sexual orientation, those who identify as LGBT tend to go toward the Democratic Party in kind of large numbers because the Democratic Party has consistently pushed for more rights for that particular demographic. So that one's not hard to figure out. If we look at family structure and we look at married versus non-married, again, we are back to economics. If you have a two-income house, you make more money, you are more likely to be Republican. If you have a single-parent household, you are more likely to make less money and be in need of social programs to assist you, and so you're going to drift more toward the Democratic end of things. Okay? All right. Now, in terms of religion, it's not as much what religion you are, it is how religious you are. And think this through, it's very logical. The more religious you are, the more likely you are to want the government to be very, very active in those moral issues. A pro-life movement, for example, that tends to drift toward the Republican end of things. Those who identify as atheist or no religious affiliation skew heavily toward the Democratic end of things because you don't believe the government ought to interfere and impose what it believes are its morals upon the general population. Okay, so that's typically how that goes. In terms of occupation, we know that white-collar workers who are more management, I see the light, who are more management, they go ahead and make more money, so more Republican, less money, we go ahead and drift more toward the Democratic end of things. Just to backtrack to race for a little bit. Now, is it accurate to say that African Americans tend to vote Democratic? Yes, it is. Absolutely. Okay. But draw the connections. They tend to vote more Democratic for a few reasons. One, they have lower education levels. Two, they have lower income levels. Three, Democrats have always pursued civil rights issues with more fervor than Republicans. So there are logical reasons why they tend to go toward that particular party. So, for example, even in a bad year for the Democratic presidential candidate, they'll get at least 83-85% of the African American vote. And in a typical year, they'll get in excess of 90% of that vote. All right. In terms of age, young folks tend to vote more Democratic. Why? You have no money. None. You really don't. Honestly. Wow. And now you want to go to college. You don't have money to pay for that. What are you thinking? Sorry, parent rant. Okay. So young folks tend to go more for the Democratic side because they don't have the income yet to want to protect their income. Also, young people tend to be focused more on individual rights. Okay. Whereas when people get older, if you get married, or even if you don't get married, your income tends to rise and you tend to be focused more on collective security. In other words, keep my kids safe, as opposed to focusing on individual rights. So you tend to drift a little bit older. You tend to drift a little bit more Republican when you get older. But then when you get to be, let's say, senior citizen age, you might drift back politically to the Democratic side because they're more in favor of heavy funding for Social Security and Medicare. So again, these things aren't totally predictable, but demographics, you gotta love them. Go where they lead you. All right, so stop for a minute, think all that over. In your mind right now, ask yourself what demographics, not issues, but what demographics cause people to drift to the liberal way of thinking, and what demographics cause people to drift toward the conservative way of thinking. All right, let's move on to public opinion, which is the fancy word for you've been polled. I've grown to appreciate polls. In fact, when those annoying people like call up on the phone, I like to talk to them because honestly, most people just hang up. So I just like to talk and ask how their day is going. realize they're just reading off a script, probably making minimum wage. Cut them some slack. All right, first of all, what is public opinion? It is polling, and it is a scientific endeavor. In order to have a scientifically accurate poll, you need to have three things quick in your mind. What are those? That's right. First, you need to have a random sample, which is probably anywhere from, 800 to 1,500 people. And remember, when they pick those people, they're going to fill certain demographic slots. For example, sometimes they'll call me on the phone and they'll want some demographics, and they'll say, can you give me your age? Can you give me your race? Can you give me your income? And then they might say, oh, thank you. I don't need you tonight. Well, what they're really saying is we have those demographic slots filled up. All right, so they're trying to get a cross-section of all demographics to be representative of either the state of Iowa or the United States, etc. So you need to have a random sample. You need to have clearly worded questions, which can be manipulated. And the last one is really where the politics come in. You need to accurately report the results. Realize that darn near every single poll you're getting on television of a political persuasion is manipulated. If it's from a political party, of course it's manipulated. They may only report the results they want. If it's from a certain news outlet with a political bias, if Fox News has a poll, if MSNBC is taking the pulse of the American people, yes, it's going to be biased. I'm sorry, it just is. So look at the methodology, that's where the fun is, and figure out how many people they sampled, what the margin of error is. Okay, so if it's an election poll and you're down by 2 points, but the margin of error is 3 plus or minus 3, by golly, you math fans will call that a tie and unpredictability. All right. The polling terms, there are 5 vocab terms. You're smart enough to know now that anytime you get 5 vocab terms in your notes, it's one multiple choice question on your test. So look them over, love them. Consensus, polarization, intensity, latency, and salience. Okay. So the best I can do is say, look those over, know them. What do we have next? All right, our political opinions and values. This is pretty similar to political socialization. It's basically saying, where do you get your thoughts from? Where do you get your political ideas from? Again, the dominant place where you get those from is from your family. Doesn't mean you all think politically like mom or dad. It means they're the number one dominant factor shaping your political viewpoints, okay? Another thing from your notes, and you know it's important because I put it in boldface type, is that these opinions tend to be formed in groups. We like to think, research-wise, that we're all wonderful individuals who can think for ourselves and make up our own opinion. Research says, no, that does not happen. So people think in groups. Family's a group, school is a group, peer group is a workplace group, a peer group. They are all groups that help you form your political opinions. All right, the next one. What about public policy and politics? What about public opinion? Try this. Does public opinion shape public policy? In other words, do politicians in Washington, D.C. look at all the polls and then change the way that they conduct policy or the opinions they have on issues? The answer is not all that much. Okay, Republicans do what they do, Democrats think what they think, and honestly, they don't care much about polling. If we see a profound shift or an overwhelming shift, for example, like opinion on the Vietnam War, historically is probably your best example, then that's going to change politics. But in all honesty, it doesn't change people that much in terms of their political votes. All right, next, if we look at voting, voting is a big, big deal, okay? Political participation. The term political participation, which comes up a lot on AP exams, think about it now. Back to our term political. What are the two components of politics? Yes, you're right. They are winning the election and making policy. Anything that attempts to influence people's opinions on who ought to win an election or people's opinions on what a policy ought to be, we're going to call political participation. So the most obvious and prevalent one is voting, but it can be political discussions. It can be involvement in interest groups, in political discussion groups. It can be in letters to the editor, working on political campaigns, etc. They're all political participation. Now, voting has a long legal history in the United States. So right now, don't look at your notes. Stop. right now come up with, let's say, 4 either amendments or laws which deal with voting. Go ahead, try it. How'd we do? If you got at least 3, that's not bad. It's only a review. It's not the it's not the test yet. Okay, there have actually been 5 amendments to the Constitution that have changed voting in America. Okay, so we had the 15th Amendment, and that is going to allow African American males to vote. We had the 19th Amendment, women can vote. We had the 23rd Amendment, residents of Washington, D.C. can vote because, you know what, they're not residents of a state, and that's where you get most of your citizenship rights. The 24th Amendment is going to outlaw the poll tax. And then we have the 26th Amendment. Yes, I see the light again. The 26th Amendment, and that, well, I thought I saw the light. The 26th Amendment is going to allow 18-year-olds to vote. And then don't forget about a couple of laws, the Indian Citizenship Act. How ironic that Native Americans became the last ones to secure their voting rights in the United States. That's ironic. And then we also have the Voting Rights Act, which is going to be the federal government's effort to ensure voting access for all Americans in the 1960s in the civil rights movement. Okay, in terms of voter registration, you have to be registered to vote. It's painfully easy to register to vote. And by golly, you get like 6 weeks prior to an election to vote, so there's really no excuse for not being there. A lot of other democracies require you to register to vote, or actually to vote itself, or they fine you. They'll take national holidays on election day. Okay, the United States does not do that. Let's look at something from your notes is the motor voter bill. Now this happened during the Clinton administration in the early to mid 90s. Clinton was a Democrat, and the reason that he wanted the motor voter bill passed, which says that anytime you renew your license or get your license the first time, you can register to vote. I'm sorry, not for the first time, but when you renew it, you can register to vote, is that they want more people voting. Democrats will win every single election if they have a high voter turnout. Why is that? Think of the demographics that tend to drift toward the Democratic Party. Statistically speaking, there are more of them in the United States than there are demographics that typically appeal to the Republican Party. Okay, so obviously the Republicans benefit from a lower voter turnout. It's their job to expand their base and appeal to more demographic groups. And all Democrats have to do just to get people to show up. All right, voter turnout, there are several different types of elections. And the more important or national the election, the higher the voter turnout. So a general election is a federal election. It happens every 2 years when we have congressional elections. Every other general election is also a presidential election. That's when you get peak turnout. And you notice that just from the numbers in your notes that when there's a presidential election, the turnout is always higher than when we have a midterm election. A midterm election, think of middle of the president's term for election. So, aka 2018, presidential election will be 2020, midterm 2022, etc. Okay, now when we get down to local elections or special elections, again, we're going to see the turnout just decrease. When we get to something like the local school board election, if you can get 15% of a community to show up, you've accomplished something. People just don't. They stay at home in their recliners and eat Cheetos. I mean, The Bachelor's on. Come on. Who would vote? But I digress. Now, the United States tends to have lower voter turnout than other countries. Why is this? Well, registration, although this is typically given as a reason, I think it's a lame reason because it's painfully easy to register and you get a long time to go ahead and do it. We do have a wider voting pool when we allow 18-year-olds to vote. From ages 18 to 21, that's a low turnout rate, typically for that group. So if Democrats want to win an election, oftentimes they'll focus on that age group. If you get more to turn out, like President Obama did, then you will have a higher chance of winning. All right. Other reasons, again, they're kind of lame. Elections being on a Tuesday, honestly, the polls are open for 12 hours and you've got 6 weeks in advance. I don't buy that, but your textbook does. All right. How do we know if you're going to vote? Well, if you have the higher your education level, the more likely you are to vote. The higher your income, the more likely you are to vote. The higher your age, the more likely you are to vote. Again, all those things say that your average Republican demographic will vote at a higher rate, will turn out at a higher rate. So low voter turnout is typically going to help Republicans. Now, what are your factors when you get in the voting booth? What are the factors influencing how you're going to vote? The number one factor, there's no doubt about it, it's what political party you belong to. Okay? If I'm a Republican and I get in the voting booth, I am 9 times out of 10, maybe more, going to vote Republican. It's just who I am. I don't even have to know the candidates. The second factor is the candidate. Okay? Maybe I had really strong feelings about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in an election. That can dictate things. All right? People tend to drift towards certain candidates. Lastly, the issues. The issues, remember them? They are a distant third. Well behind the party, definitely behind the candidate. People might say, you know what, I have a strong feeling on tax rates in America. I have a strong feeling on federal funding of government programs or on foreign policy involvement, etc. Okay? All right. Those are your notes. There's not as much content. You're going to do well on this test. All right? So again, go over your demographics. Voting and voter turnout's a big deal. Who we are and how we're oriented politically is a big deal in this unit. And also the history of voting. Don't forget about that. That's significant as well. Thanks.